joining us for Asia Society's 2021 Arts and Museum Summit. My name is Sarah Mccaffrey, the manager of Interdisciplinary Arts at Asia Society Museum, New York. We're thrilled to kick off the one and only event of its type throughout the summit, the Artist Spotlight, Contending with Coloniality Through Performance. The two artists presenting today are Anida Yoeu Ali and Tania Khoury, who will each give a 15-minute presentation followed by discussion moderated by Việt Lê. At the end of the event, we will take questions from the audience. So please submit your questions via the Q&A tab on the Hopin platform at any point during the presentations or discussion. It's now my pleasure to introduce the moderator, Việt Lê. Việt is an artist, curator, and associate professor of the History of Art and Visual Studies in the Visual and Critical Studies graduate program at California College of the Arts. And to learn more about the moderator and our panelists, please see the link that will be dropped in the chat, which includes all of their bios. And so without further ado, I'll pass it off to Việt so we can begin. Thanks, Việt.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm your moderator, Việt Lê, Associate Professor of Visual Studies, California College of the Arts. And first, I'd like to thank Asia Society and staff, particularly Michelle Young Maplethorpe and Sarah Mccaffrey, and all of you in the audience for joining today. And today's featured artist, Anida Yoeu Ali, artist and senior artist in residence, School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences, University of Washington, Bothell, and Tania Khoury, artist and director, OSUN Center for Human Rights and the Arts, Bard College. So, as Sarah mentioned, each speaker will present for 15 minutes. So please take it away, Anida.
Thank you, Việt. Thanks, everyone. And special thanks to Sarah and Michelle. So we begin with the first slide, or the second one in this case. In 1979 is really where we begin a refugee camp between the border of Thailand and Cambodia, a camp whose name I do not know. We begin here in the in-between. These two photographs are the only images that I have of myself. They are artifacts from a traumatic period in my family's history and ultimately my legacy. These images are the closest things to owning my, quote, baby photos, except here, I am obviously not a baby. I am 5 years old, a redhead that's really scorched from the 1979 sun. And I am pictured as the little girl to the right of a box, a care package from our Thai family who found us after they received word that perhaps some of us may have survived the 3 years, 7 months, and 20 days of the Khmer Rouge brutality. And I place these family photos at the beginning of my talks to remind myself not only where I come from, but also the ways in which photography continues to serve as a critical extension of self and place, and the ways in which photos can fill in lapses to memories, the gaps of absence to which, there is no recovery. And so a photo can extend a moment, and that is ultimately critical to my practice. Next slide. And although I rely on a photo to extend these moments, it's the series of actions before and after the captured still, that's my art. It's the performance and what happens between the performer and the public. It's the encounters and exchanges. So growing up as an Asian and Muslim American refugee woman, I learned to perfect my English, speaking without the accent that had marked my family as other and foreign. I sharpened my verbal skills as a weapon, but when I started to travel overseas to share my spoken word poetry and very English-based storytelling, which often centered my traumas, speaking about racism, misogyny, oppression, genocide, I felt that my perfect English failed me, that language failed me, because people outside of America, including my fellow Cambodians, could not understand the nuance of my story or the craft in my verbal expression. People felt the energy and passion of my performance, but didn't have a clue as to what I was saying. Even when the words were translated, there was a deep loss of the moment experienced. It was a moment for me to decolonize my practice, shift it to a form that felt more freeing, and ultimately something that could transcend borders and languages. In 2006, next slide, my work started to shift to performance art, which opened up whole new worlds and unlocked my own imagination and new possibilities. So on performance, I get asked this question a lot: why performance? And my response is always, well, why not? I mean, here's a medium that anyone can do, and it can happen anywhere, anytime, and is for and by anyone. Performance, it's both immediate and it takes time, where the body is necessary and where the body matters. And so for me, performance has always been an obvious act of decolonization. I feel like there's a freedom in performing in public spaces and enacting fantastical, mythical heroines that's often extremely needed and powerful. Next slide. It's about reclaiming power and occupying public spaces and reimagining hyperpresence. For me, performance activates. It heals, it provokes, it compels, disrupts, intervenes, responds, and then it acknowledges that my body is necessary, that it has meaning and content, and that ultimately my body matters. And the engagement in a performance makes you, meaning me and or the audience, feel something. And the power of experience performance shifts between the performer and the public. So in my journey through nonverbal performance and my use of stillness, it becomes a quest to extend my narrative in other spaces that I can't necessarily inhabit through translation. So in many ways, I love that the live interaction is creating moments for multiple peoples that become a story. And then this performance then continues and extends itself further through my recount of the performance and people's sort of range of reactions. And it's almost as if the performance, can never end in its retelling, recounting, or exhibiting through artifacts. So it's really a lot like an early poem I have in which I state that the journey never ends for the refugee. Next slide. So speaking more on decolonization, I believe that performance allows for a magic of reinventing the self and projecting an alter ego, a sort of larger than life persona that isn't imprisoned by oppressive representations. There's an awareness of the spectacle and ultimately a power in reclaiming the gaze, which, has trapped and dehumanized so many of us. And so in my performance works, I recenter my body in the conversation that I'm about to have with the public, which is often done in silence over time and through various public spaces with unassuming gestures. My work is performance installation, next slide, where meters and meters of textile act as skin, as a way for the surface of my body to extend into these public spaces and as a metaphoric device for stories to spread across an expanse. But those stories aren't literal or spoken. It's really a shift from my original early narrative text-based work, which I'm not presenting at all here, into creating a visual world that is activated through presence. And it's the presence of my body, gestures, and these encounters of the people I call the unsuspecting public. For me, nonverbal communication has more power and impact to reach more people and to reach across borders. Next slide. I consider most of my work as necessary interventions, and I'm playful in these engagements. I'm not interested in retelling the story of my trauma or my family's trauma or my people's trauma. I did that in a lot of my written work early in my 20s and 30s. Now I want to experience joy, compassion, and then maybe slightly throw people off, especially since the image I'm creating tends to complicate monolithic identities. I also know that people in general don't expect to see this specific Asiatic face with this very stoic countenance, which I've inherited from my grandmother and mother, this visage to occupy the different characters I've created, from the white mother to the Buddhist bug to the red chador. I'm interested in a hypervisibility and an acknowledgement of my presence. I tend to place my body with colors that evoke some kind of joy and pleasure. And it's what I call an infusion of fabulousness. Next slide. My work, as mentioned, is nonverbal and is about offering people an experience of difference being able to engage. So with the Buddhist bug, it's essentially a creation myth sprung from my interest in hybridity, transcendence, and otherness. And it's a piece that I've really come to terms with in terms of trying to be empowered through the diasporic dilemma. And that diasporic dilemma is the idea that our identities are in flux and that we are constantly fluctuating between the insider and outsider, between the local and foreign, between wandering and staying put, staying rooted. And so this is what I'm trying to explore through the Buddhist bug. And really, it's set intentionally amongst school children from my birth village, an ox cart driver, a Muslim fishing village, and random people in busy alleyways. And my work engages everyday people in an effort to include them into conversations that are rarely afforded them in the context of contemporary art. So you'll see that from daylight to nightfall, inside classrooms, outside amusement parks, along stairways and street corners, the Buddhist bug appears, and the bug is present, visible, and ever curious. And so, this really speaks, next slide, that as an artist, I've never been able to quietly create works inside a studio space. That's really a luxury I've never had. Instead, my works are performances that are taken into the streets, near bus stops and public transportation spaces, hawker stands, inside and outside galleries, but a lot of it is outside of galleries. And it takes it there to kind of continue this need to extend my story that is now non-literal into these spaces. So the red chador is another larger than life persona that I've created here. And in these final minutes of presenting the red chador, let's go to the next slide. I'd like to read some of the comments that I've overheard in 2015 on the campus that I was a professor, visiting assistant professor at. These were the comments that I overheard. Why is she looking at me? Oh my God, what the fuck is that? I just don't get it. Can she see out of that? What's going on? I'm so scared. I'm calling my mom. No way, she's a professor. I'm calling campus security. Anyone get the eyes from the red cloak lady today? Definitely her clock building eyes. I told you not to take my photo. It's people like you that start trouble. Hey, can you talk? Hey, I'm speaking to you. Next slide. And then I want to end with this sort of statement I've made before in the Red to Door. There is no such thing as responding to only one issue, not when we are complex human beings living in an interconnected, geopoliticized world where people's existence are being questioned, surveilled, dismissed, and ultimately violated in brutal ways. Next slide. As a Muslim woman and artist, I cannot just confront Islamophobia. I must address all forms of violence that attempt to use hate, fear, and prejudice actions against marginalized bodies. Just as our identities are intersectional, so are the issues we choose to align with in this political moment. My epic reimagining of the Red to Door, next slide, to be birthed amongst 98 other brightly colored chadors is a response to alienation and erasure, Islamophobia and homophobia, misogyny and state-sanctioned violence through a hyper-visibility of performed bodies. Perhaps one work of art can't do it all, but maybe we can begin to complicate monolithic constructions of identities by imagining a more dynamic, collective possible future under a new, fabulous political spectrum. Next slide. This might be the final slide, actually. So that's all that I have, and you're looking at sort of the latest performance, which was done on the 20th anniversary of September 11th, just a couple months ago.
Thank you, Anida, for your moving and provocative presentation and thinking about the limits of language and, as Derda writes, the limits of logos, and moving away from this kind of binary of hyper-visible, invisible towards what you call a hyper-presence of joy and compassion, and which will continue in the discussion to unpack these ideas. Our next speaker is Tania Khoury, and very happy to welcome you. Please, Tania.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I am honored to be sharing this space with the inspiring Anida and Viet. I would like to first acknowledge that I'm currently residing on the sacred homelands of the Munsee and the Mohikanook people, who are the original stewards of this land. Today, due to forced removal, the community resides in northeast Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge Munsee community. I honor and pay respect to their ancestors, past and present, as well as to future generations, and I recognize their continuing presence in their homelands. There are very few times in which I thought of myself as an Arab artist. Not that I doubted my cultural and political identity, but identities tend to be pushed to the fore when we are either othered or find ourselves in periods of mass upheaval and political transformation. I find myself increasingly thinking of myself as an Arab artist by nature of being a migrant in the heart of the American empire. In my 20s, when I lived in London, I felt myself belonging to the makeshift underground live art scene. I rarely thought of my otherness until one day another artist insisted on reading my work as a representation of millions of Arab women. I later felt a sweeping sensation of Arabness when the Arab uprisings began in 2010. I quickly belonged to the Arab youth who were geographically far from the uprisings, but obsessively following the news being broadcasted minute by minute on social media. My body tuned into the time zone of the revolting squares. I woke up when the protesters did, or at least when their tweets resumed. It was an overwhelming feeling of sensing a deep connection to millions chanting in Arabic while being physically miles away in a rented apartment in East London, isolated from my immediate surrounding. For the first time, I felt a world apart from my colleagues, collaborators, and chosen London family, who upon that moment shared my everything, which was live art practice, also our chosen language. I began to trace my journey back home. In Lebanon, we struggled with defeated revolutions, crushed protests, and a similarly alienating neoliberalist political system, minus the healthcare and the basic services we found in Europe. We also struggled with lack of public and private funding in the arts. In Lebanon, the art world also spoke English, and although it understood the language of the revolution and often joined in it, it remained an elitist, centralized, and institutionalized practice for the rich. There are, of course, inspiring cooperatives and collaborative initiatives that countered the alienation and colonial legacies of the art world in Beirut. For the sake of time, I will not discuss these right now, but there are a breath of fresh air that practices the revolution on a daily basis. Instead, I want to draw a picture of the various journeys in and out of Arab cities that I found myself and other artists engaging in during the last decade, when we negotiate personal safety, financial stability, alienation, and belonging. Sometimes these journeys become the artwork itself. I will share with you 2 works that I've created in the last 5 years in which travel, refuge, migration, and coloniality are central. We'll watch the first video of The Search for Power. Search for Power is an interactive performance in which the audience is invited to look at collected archival documents that tell the story of electricity blackouts in Lebanon. Blackouts have been part of our daily life in Lebanon for as long as we remember. They are increasingly rampant and currently threatening the livelihood of vulnerable people who rely on electricity to remain alive. In order to tell the story of this phenomenon, myself and Ziad Abu-Rish, a historian who also happened to be my husband, found that we needed to travel across 5 countries to build the various pieces of narrative related to a Lebanese state institution. As many people from my generation who are born during the Lebanese Civil War, I attributed all malfunction in the country to the Civil War. We have blackouts because of the Civil War. We have a privatized seashore because of the Civil War. In reality, both these statements are factually wrong. While corruption certainly exasperated during the Civil War, the spread of the privatization of public space and the deterioration of public services long preceded the Civil War. They are, in fact, as old as the country itself. The country that was carved as a colonial project was born with the very notion of disregard to ordinary people's lives. The colonial project relies on the local elites to maintain power, order, and business. The elites amass power and capital while they watch the wider population perish as collateral damage. The archival documents needed to tell the story of why we have daily power cuts in Lebanon were unattainable in Lebanon. We had to search the French colonial archive and read letters from Monsieur Duchamp to other French, Belgian, British, and Lebanese men, negotiating price and performance, discussing concern on organizing labor power, and keeping a close eye on strikes and boycotts. Some letters were handwritten on paper branded by local luxurious hotels built through land grab on the Beiruti seashore. We found them along telegrams sent by electricity workers in codes because they knew they were being watched by colonial lords. Our research journey revealed much needed information. Some was sickening, but not shocking. We experienced the irony of feeling cared for and welcomed in Western colonial national archives like that of France, UK, and Belgium, after being rejected by local Lebanese ministries and other authorities who maintain a close grip on the information. Perhaps historians and people who deal with archives on a daily basis have made peace with this contradiction. But for me as an artist who work both in my home country and around the world, both in my native language and in many translations, I found myself unsure how to feel about this. I was holding documents that proved how colonialism worked: surveillance of workers, pressure on local government, disregard to the local population. I was also extremely aware that this work has been enabled by European funding for the arts and the accessibility of European state archives for researchers. We also did not want to fall into the trope of pointing the finger at Western audience and yelling at them their colonial history while letting local elites back home completely off the hook. It was a dance of alienation, belonging, and blame, and I wasn't the only one performing it. I would like to also share with you another piece that I recently did. In 2019, I opened a work entitled Cultural Exchange Rate. Researching this piece also required various travels to build a non-existing archive, but this time the archive was largely personal, in addition to official state documents. The archive belonged to my own family and their various attempts to cross borders and survive across a century of time. Let's watch the video. She would ask me to cut or comb her hair.
knew when I saw my shop. She said, perhaps you're writing the name. I gave her all the possibilities. Discovering this cadre and wilderness. Ceci fosse esperava e se regresso fosse valide.
Riflette i tempi che cambiano in quel periodo. Il cristianesimo fu
construyó una casa. Una vez acabado el dinero que se llevó de México, los niños dejaron la escuela y empezaron a trabajar para sobrevivir. Al cabo de 10 años, el padre volvió de México. I was looking for Sada, my great-grandmother, and Rashid, my great-grandfather. I found 2 women with names close enough to Sada.
Looking at both these works and the mobility that the process required make me a little bit nostalgic about for a pre-pandemic world, but also make me wonder about the near and the future and the sustainability in art production. I am, of course, privileged to be an artist who built a career on international touring and being on different sides of morbid borders. But the world we live in today has increasingly scarce resources, and artists from the global south find themselves again exiled, pushed away, and forced to negotiate borders, colonial legacies, and accessibilities with all its contradictions and the malin. Thank you.
Thank you, Tania, for sharing your powerful journey from individual to collective identities between Arab identities and localizing global identities, and also for thinking through the palimpsest archives of power and this journey from powerlessness to empowerment. So the next section, we're going to be having a 30-minute discussion. And oh, Anida, you're back. And yes, we were having slight technical difficulties. So for this discussion, I want to frame it around this idea of rhizomatic keywords. And so the few keywords are strategies, refugees, spiritualities, vulnerability, and voice. So the first question is about strategies. So connecting this conversation, today's conversation, to the summit's first day, Professor Gayatri Spivak asserted that decolonial rhetoric and neoliberalism are linked, short-term surface treatments. I would agree that empire absorbs and then redeploys critique from within and without, as Tania's presentation embodies. In wrestling with this, in the first panel, curator Sarah Raza spoke of the idea of contraband as a sort of strategy of smuggling. So can you both speak to formal aesthetic long-term strategies you engage with simultaneously working with and challenging neoliberal cultural institutions such as museums, biennials, galleries? For instance, Anida, I see you using color, and Tania using structures in tactical ways, but first let me elaborate. So on color, and for Anida, all of your work uses very vibrant hues to stunning effect. The Buddhist bug is a particular hue of orange I see often and have seen again and again coming in and out of Southeast Asia and having lived in Southeast Asia for a while. And the latest iterations of the red chador also uses rainbow cacophony of color. So how is color a potentially subversive and, as you mentioned, celebratory strategy?
Hi, thank you for that question. How? I think it comes down to just not fitting into people's narratives. And by that, I mean sort of a dominant culture, the kind of, hegemony that we're living under that tends to, like what Tania was saying, where she felt like she had to represent millions of Arab women suddenly. I mean, we, as artists of color, in particular to America, have had to bear that burden of representation. And then when we create things, so even with the colors, and I'm using religious aesthetics in a lot of my work, but there's a tendency to try to explain this. Like, I can't just be on a quest and a journey to have joy and to have beauty in my life. Like, I have to be that constant, documentary that they're all watching and looking at these bodies that are devastated and war torn, and that is a part of my reality and my past. I don't deny that, but come on, can we move on from that if we're ready to, meaning the artist, if the artist chooses to? Can we not be pigeonholed in a way that isn't fully authentic to our more holistic selves? And can we be experimental, even if it is literal? Can we still be that and have these moments where we're enjoying our process of creating these works? And so, color is important to me because my culture is colorful. I mean, it's as simplistic as that. I'm not surrounded by just black chadors or white chador prayer garments. I am surrounded by constant color and patterns and energy. And a lot of it is because I grew up with aunties and grandmothers and, other friends of the family whose hijab or headscarf or religious identity or cultural identity wasn't a burden, but was joyful and pleasurable and kind of a non-issue in many ways, And so I'm just trying to figure out ways to celebrate things without a dominant narrative being placed on me as if I have to represent someone else's image of who I am and who supposedly my people are.
Thank you, Anida. I appreciate you underlining the expectations of an artist of color, having these kind of colored, which colors your perception. And I also thought of Michael Tossig's book, What Color is Sacred, and what you said about this infusion of fabulousness, that it's multiplicity and multitudinous, right? A celebration. So continuing our discussion of strategies, Tania, I'm really interested in this idea of structure. And as we kind of exchanged before, can you speak to the structures or interactions, the frameworks of your performance installations as a strategy of engagement? I see the structures as a metaphor for the strictures of state violence or even disciplinary binds.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's thank you again for this question. I think it's a constant negotiation between countering state violence, but also being aware of how some of these states that we're encountering are enabling us to create this work. So this kind of contradiction that I try to talk about makes us a little bit more, makes the situation a bit more complex in our relationship to state institutions, state violence, colonial legacies. At the same time, my relationship with art institutions have been quite complex as well, because I was able to survive, coming from working class background, I was able to survive as an artist because I toured excessively and I was given a lot of, I was given opportunities by art institutions. At the same time, like Anida, I was mainly interested in working in real spaces and spaces that are not, that don't hide behind the kind of the safety of a neutral art space. And where relationship with the audience is already defined and already predictable. I wanted to counter that. I wanted to work with people who happen to pass by or who happen to use those spaces. I've also recently, because you mentioned that I'm directing the OSUN Center for Human Rights and the Arts right now at Bard College, and this is like a new role that I'm being at, because I never really had kind of proper job in an institution before. And it's really interesting for me to be someone who don't come from institutions and be suddenly in a leading role in an institution and to negotiate that. And so far, I feel like I have the opportunity to push an institution to be more artist-centric and to think about equity and accessibility all the time. And I hope, more artists get invited to these tables where they have a say in how their lives are being decided on. At the same time, we can think about it later, but I think the form that I use sit also in kind of in between art and non-art, in between institutions, art institutions, and the kind of real life, because I use interactivity that can be encountered by people as something else. People can come to my work thinking it's a dinner invitation. They can come to some of my work and think it's just a walk in the city, like almost like a touristic walk in the city. So it's not really presented or use the form of art, again, in a predictable, traditional way, especially theater, where people are sitting in the darkness, kind of in a safe space, or in situation of kind of visual art where you can just walk in and out without really feeling immersed in the work.
Thank you, Tania, for reflecting on structures and strategies and really the complex negotiations that we have to constantly maneuver. But then this also echoes what Anida was saying in terms of thinking through being in flex or in between as a strategy, and also transparency and engagement. So this leads me to the next question in terms of community and engagement. And the second keyword is refugees and refuge. Like you, Anida, I also stayed in a Thai refugee camp, which I don't remember the name of, in the aftermath of the wars in Southeast Asia in the late 1970s. And Tania, your work addresses more historically recent refugees tied to Lebanon, Syria, Palestine. In the mass mainstream media, there are often overdetermined connections between the militarized engagements and migrations then and now. I often see headlines which kind of make my stomach churn. The lessons of the Vietnam War in the Middle East, and this gets repeated, the lessons of XYZ. And this hyper-visible trope often underlines what I call a pornography of violence, spectacles of suffering. And I know you spoke to this, Anida, before, briefly. Beyond stereotypical narratives of trauma, can you elaborate, or can you please elaborate more as migrants on mediating refuge, healing, stillness, and what you call joy and compassion in your practice?
Yeah, and I also want to correct that I don't think Palestinians are recent refugees. They've been a refugee population and stateless for a very long time, even before the influx of Southeast Asian refugees. I'm just tired of suffering. I mean, that's what it comes down to. I mean, how much suffering do people to various communities who are minoritized and who have dealt with the capacity of the U.S. to, intervene and throw their weight around and bomb your country. Like how much of that do we have to keep carrying the anger and manifest it, through the work? There has to be a different strategy for the sustainability of ultimately the artist's self. And it's not to make this egotistical, but I am the only one out of hundreds of people who are related to me. I am the only one who's an artist. There's a weight already in that role that I feel, coming from also a working class family. There are already conversations that I'm having with my family, as an artist and as an artist who began to tell stories that are so specific to my lived experience with words, and then to kind of shift that and make it into, something other than being literal with the text. And so, I'm just looking for strategies where I feel in a good place to be able to share the work beyond the suffering and the trauma. And I think it's just really important because we're surrounded every day. You go through Instagram, and maybe because if you're politicized in a certain way, the things that you see, you connect to your own feelings of what more can I do to help. And that's a huge question. And, as I ended my talk with, it's that the burden can't all be on one work or one artist or even a handful of artists. It's like a multilateral approach in which the artist is important. And I wish more places and countries could value that, and then society as a whole. And I think that's part of the problem, is kind of involving the artist in more facets of policy making and life making and culture making. I think that would be a start.
Thank you, Anida. I also on the same page with you in terms of kind of the burden of representation and the limits of that, and what happens with the afterlife of trauma, right? How do you move from trauma towards a healing? And thanks also for the correction. I meant more in terms of news cycles. And so also back to you, Tania, how do you think of kind of moving from trauma to healing, or holding them both in tandem?
Yeah.
In stillness, particularly.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, I feel like I belong to this generation of artists who had a complete repoliticization in the Arab uprising, and particularly because they were the first uprisings that were so present in the social media. So we were living them, consuming them, interacting with them, fighting about them all at the same time. I think as a person who works with visual representation and visual elements, this marked me completely and changed how I think about the power of the visual and sound as well, and interactivity and relationship to public space. So I think in these instances, there was a lot of there was this confrontation between these two ways of thinking. One is to just put what's happening out there for the world to see, whether it's corpses, violence, everything, like a complete exposure of what's happening in real life, live, because we understood the power of being citizen journalists and not having our reality be edited various times by foreign journalists who would report, and then their editors will change the language again, and then it becomes watered down at the end. At the same time, there have been a lot of voices from artists and activists who are saying, who were talking about the dignity of people who were stripped out of their life, dignity of people who were stripped out of their kind of sovereignty, bodily sovereignty. There is a wonderful anonymous group from Syria called Abu Nadara who created short film every single week in the early days of the Syrian uprising. And they wrote a lot about it, saying that our stories are not just about exposing corpses and counting our dead, but telling a narrative that is different, a narrative that is not forced on us, but that we will create, and we will create both in words, visual, and sound. And I was marked by that. I think I was changed by that. A lot of us have, previously felt that it was just about literally showing death to people rather than finding other ways to do that. As you probably know, I work a lot with oral history, and I think this is a powerful tool to tell ordinary people's, to force almost like the ordinary people's narrative in when events and spaces are contested, because it's often just war on narrative that we are part of. And state violence is not just about when you get killed, like in the context of Syria, for example, and in the occupation of Palestine, you don't only get killed by oppression or by military dictatorship or military occupation. You are also, the narrative get, after you die, you're not free of that. They kind of follow you after you're dead, and either call you a terrorist or call you or invent a total different story of how you died and what you stood for. So just telling stories of ordinary people, publishing them, creating work that is interactive, in which the audience are not just listening and understanding those stories, but actually placing themselves inside those stories, having a sort of embodied knowledge of these stories becoming part of who they are physically and in kind of multisensory. I use a lot of smell, I use touch, the tactile, as well as obviously the visual and sound.
Yes, so the embodied sonic aspects of kind of these ghostly traces. And also want to highlight what you said about death is not the only story, that there's agency in thinking through, not the only story, not the only image, right? That there's kind of multiple layers through that, and how do you counteract these hegemonic narratives. And so the third keyword is vulnerability and intimacy, Tania. I think this is a strategy you deploy. And in your essay entitled Creating Intimacy and Curating Borders, you write about vulnerability, intimacy, and mutual care as ways to engage the political with audiences. And I'm quoting you. Quote, "It seems particularly crucial to view our audience as allies or allies to be, for we have nothing left other than our solidarity and a sense of radical care and love that counters the state violence," unquote. And this is really powerful. And similarly, Judith Butler really opened my eyes to thinking that vulnerability and grief, you think it's a kind of a solitary gesture. It actually really opens us up profoundly towards collectivized political action, right? Rather than being closed, and it opens us up. Can you talk more about engendering vulnerable interactions with your practice?
Yeah, I think, thank you for this question. I think this was mainly inspired by feminist literature and feminist strategies, actually, of mutual care and shared vulnerability. I kind of more in line with this ways of being rather than work that is just about kind of forcing political views or being offered as just kind of as a political protest. Even though I understand its importance and sometimes it disrupts power dynamics just to have a powerful protest art or posters or, you know, shouting men. But in the work that I am interested in, as I said in that text, think about audience care as well, or engaging in a mutual care, just because I feel when people are relaxed or trust you as an artist or as a performer in front of them, they open up. And when they open up, sometimes ugly things come out. You know, I wrote another text that says sexist and racist people go to the theater too, or something of that sort. I forgot the title, but it was mainly about that actually when you work with an interactive work, people just tend to romanticize it, that this is beautiful, we're intimate together, beautiful things happen. But actually, it's beautiful and intimate, but when this happens, a lot of ugly things come out too. And that's totally fine, because I think when we're exposed to our own politics, this is where change might happen or transformation might happen. So I think about interactivity as having political potential. And the potential really happens when people interact with the work, open up, they're involved in a multisensory experience that allow them to not just rationalize, but think through their skin, feel things through vibration, through smell, and at the same time being distant, so it's not really a kind of sensationalist experience of that it's like a music that it's forcing certain emotions on you, but understanding the audience understand that this is an invitation, and that they will be cared for rather than pushed into situation or yelled at or whatever. And in that sense, I feel that, or in those spaces, I feel that there is a potential for transformation, for dialogue, for carrying with you stories that become part of who you are.
Thank you, Tania. And I love this idea of mutual care, interaction, vulnerability, and also listening, or radical listening, as you referenced in another interview. Yeah. And I'm also indebted to feminist scholars and also queer theory and BIPOC intersectional theory, and thinking about silence or, you know, vulnerability or actually passivity as also something profound and as political action. So technically we're moving on to the audience Q&A. And so audience members, if you have any questions, please type them into the box that you have there. So far we don't have questions. So I'll, you know, be a super fan and continue to ask both of you questions. So please, again, audience members out there, please ask any questions, or we can also engage questions among ourselves. But So my, I guess, audience question, or for me, is about spirituality and audience. Since Tanya was speaking about audience earlier, and this is for Anida, and I've had the kind of honor and pleasure to, be your superfan stalker in time, across time and place in Cambodia, where we both lived for a bit, San Francisco, Hawaii, where you did a Shangri-La residency with your partner in Studio Revolt collaborator, Masahiro Sugano. An undercurrent in your work is spirituality, from the Buddhist bugs, Muslim Buddhist hybridity, to the red Chador's embodied feminine, what I call diasporic divine. You highlight the divine within the everyday, and I love these kind of scenes of the bug and the market, etc., or the red Chador interacting with people at the bus stop, but in silence. How do you differently address these audiences across the geopolitical and spiritual spectrum?
I think a lot of that is based on the local political climate, right? Because the Red Chador was commissioned in 2015, and it was really my response to France's bigotry, and France being a former colonizer of Cambodia and other Muslim majority countries. I mean, Cambodia is not a Muslim majority country, but I'm making that parallel because at the time it was, the country was responding to the Charlie Hebdo caricature artist killings. And there was massive headlines in the newspapers that were positioning Muslim bodies in a very frightening manner. And a lot of it was around a very specific use of language about beheadings and executions. And so, it just felt like I had to disrupt this in creating this heroine figure. And because I'm using religious aesthetics, the Red Chador is actually a combination of the pageantry of Catholicism with my love of what the cardinals and bishops wear, and obviously also paralleling that to the Muslim coverings. And so, when you come up with these ideas and it's a performance work, you essentially are disrupting these public spaces and inserting yourself in spaces that you are mostly unwelcomed. And there are some times when you are welcomed, and I think that's the power of these encounters that I have. And it's a range from the ones I spoke about where there's a resistance to it. And a lot of what I'm doing is kind of, I don't have to do much but exist and costume myself. And the rest, the audience sort of starts to figure out, what's playing with their either fear or their embracing of the moment. And I think that when I get the moments where it's a little more intimate and special, and a lot comes out from those audiences that are experiencing it, they become these stories that fuel me. Someone whispering to me what they're feeling, it's powerful. It's powerful to receive that and to have that intimacy with a stranger. I think those little stories sort of help me.
Thank you, Anida. I love that these interactions are mutually transformative, and as Tanya was saying, an act of mutual care. So we have a question from Viva Joshi. How do you, as an artist, negotiate the space between formal training in art institutions and your imaginations as an artist free of parameters set by such training?
I can start. Actually, for me it's an interesting question, because I've I've actually trained in theater department throughout my life. I have a BA in theater, MA in theater, PhD in theater. I also taught in various theater departments, but I never created a piece in a theater. And I don't think I will ever do that. So for me, it's an interesting negotiation, because I come from that world. I understand it really well. One could say I'm probably an expert in it, but I am also a practitioner. I'm essentially an artist, and rather than a scholar, I mean. But it was a very informed decision for me that I'm not interested in that relationship that traditional theater imposes, as a space, as a relationship to audience, as a predictable ways of being, as the hierarchy that comes with theater from the various roles that people in theater work with, let's say director, actors, stage manager, etc. So this is my how I negotiated. I just think that the education really helped me be informed in what I don't want to do and what I borrow from it. So obviously I borrow a lot of the theatricality, presence, even acting, which I never really kind of thought of myself as an actor. But having been trained so much in acting techniques and performance presence, I feel that sometimes they're used in intervention that are very subtle and that they happen without any kind of notion of acting. So yeah, that's my response. You can learn it and not use it.
Thank you, Tania. Anida?
Yeah, I had a very different experience in graduate school. I really felt not accepted with the work I was doing, which was narrative based. I felt a real push towards the conceptual. And ultimately, my MFA thesis in the school's 150-year history of School of the Art Institute Chicago, it's been the only thesis work of a student that's been vandalized. And that work was called 1700% Project Mistaken for Muslim. And it was an experiment to really bring the stories of the communities into the gallery space and be loud and disruptive, and sort of talk about hate crimes against Muslims. This was around 2010. And, so it was sort of the cherry on top of my 3-year excursion and attempt to be in this institution. And that was traumatic to have that happen, and then to not have administration assist or be a champion of the work, or even come up with a zero tolerance policy that we're not going to stand for any sort of defacement of another student's work. So I really speak foul of my graduate time and resist that. And oftentimes, and I did that because I thought I wasn't getting enough formal training, because decades prior, I had to really go and find my own workshops and create my own spaces of being in community with other people who were either multimedia theater artists, to spoken word poetry for Asian Americans, to a collective of Asian American artists and people of color working in movement. So I've always, for my entire life, have worked to make spaces where I didn't feel there were ones that existed for me, and have learned through workshops that come through my city, or when I'm elsewhere, I sort of pick up morsels of these things. And that's been my classroom, is really that engagement. And those, workshops and things that were offered through various communities were the things I could afford. I mean, I am still in debt from being in graduate school, and I refused to pay also because of what happened to me. And I felt like I got a foul deal. So, that to me is, I recognize when I work in places like Cambodia, though, the privilege I do come in there with. That absolutely. And that is very obvious. And that's where I have to kind of humble myself a little bit. And then this is where you also become a mentor to pass on the knowledge that you do have to the others around you. And I think that, to me, is a mutual learning experience. And I hope that answers it.
Thanks, Anida. I'm sorry, and it's unfortunate to hear that act of vandalization, but it really embodies this, or a metaphor for institutional structural violence. But then I think of that, in your journey to find workshops, that also sometimes these structures don't exist, that we have to build them, as artists of color transnationally. In the interest of time, we had these other interesting, compelling questions, which I'll just briefly highlight for us to think about as we move on to the other panels. Can performance itself be an act of decolonization? And a question about arts and human rights and agency and decision-making. So that's a brief paraphrase, but just in summary and in concluding our discussion, I'm really moved by this idea of voice and silence, and the Buddhist bug or the wretched does not necessarily is mute, but then of course is powerful. And this kind of silence is not being unable to speak, but is in some ways a refusal, like you said, refusing the institution. And also, Tania, this idea of silence or voice as kind of engaging with the past, voices that are dead and alive. And I just want to underscore again what we talked about in terms of keyword strategy, silence, spirituality, void, vulnerability. And so hopefully we can continue to hold these vulnerable spaces for each other and spaces of mutual care and joy. I think joy is very important. Now I'm going to hand it off back to Sarah Mccaffrey to close.
Thanks so much, Viet. And I wanted to extend a deep thanks to all three of you. It's really a testament to ongoing dedication to performance, art, and humanity. And it's really powerful to see you three and hear and experience you in conversation. And I know that there's so much that we can take from this as we move forward in the summit. So I really wanted to thank you all.